Chemistry. I know it, you know it. Lessons in Chemistry. I read it, you read it. The 2022 novel by Bonnie Garmus is, in the academic lingo, hot shit. It sold over 2.5 million copies in the US, according to the New York Times. I was aware of it last year, but it wasn't until this summer that the recommendations really started to roll in. And as with most things my dear friends and family asked me to read, I really wanted to hate it. They were all casual fans, not like me, a real book enjoyer. I would point out everything wrong with it, before creeping away to read more obscure short stories about oppressed Russian men. That's not exactly what happened. While I wouldn't call Lessons in Chemistry a good book, I just can't bring myself to hate it. It does a lot right, a lot wrong, and then, when the dust starts to settle, it brings out the psychic dog. Okay, let's get into it. Meet Zot. Not that Zot. That was a joke for all my Albanian homies. Meet Elizabeth Zot. It's the 1960s. Let's all wear polka dot and mention LBJ in passing. Like all great works of literature, we start with a flash forward. I don't know exactly why any novel does this. I always read it as, okay, so the start of this is pretty boring, but look at all this exciting stuff later. Bet you'll want to stick around for that. I guess it works in a blurry, Breaking Bad sort of way. Like how some novels start with a paragraph in italics, raising some questions, you figure out how it all connects. But that's not what this is. Zot is the star of a famous cooking show, Supper at 6. She also has a daughter. Wonder if she'll get pregnant at some point. Wonder how that happens. So with all mystery neatly removed, we can flash back to 1951, where the story starts proper. Zot is a chemist. She was forced out of her PhD program at UCLA after she was sexually assaulted by her supervisor. It's a harrowing scene, and it sets the tone for the novel as serious, tense, reflective, challenging. Yeah, this book has a bit of a tone problem. When we meet Zot, she's a research chemist at the Hastings Institute. It's there she meets Calvin Evans, our love interest. The whole book, Garmus tries to sell Calvin as this brooding anti-hero, a genius with a notorious ability to hold a grudge. I never quite figured out against whom, but the narrator tells us that's the case, so who am I to argue? All we ever see him do, though, is act like an awkward teenager. Smart, but more spoiled than troubled. They meet at work, and eventually run into each other in the foyer of an opera house where Calvin throws up over her, which, as I understand it, is the most attractive thing a man can do. They fall in love, move in together, adopt a dog, argue. If it sounds like I'm skipping over the romance part of this novel, it's because, when I look back over Lessons in Chemistry, the specifics of the central relationship just aren't that important. I've seen people call this a romance book, but when a friend asked me what the book was about, I found I could get the point across perfectly well without mentioning Calvin at all. The real meat of the story is Elizabeth's journey in a male-dominated field, and later, the profound effect she has on women who watch her show. Before I get to the next big plot point, I want to bring up a line from a blurb I found. I think it was in the Goodreads summary. Lessons in Chemistry is laugh out loud funny. We have already mentioned the first sexual assault scene. We haven't mentioned the next one, but we're right around the time when our love interest, the brilliant, the kind Calvin Evans, gets run over by a police car. It's graphic too. Gets his skull popped open like a watermelon. I don't know whether I'd describe any novel with that kind of trauma sandwich as laugh out loud funny. Through the subsequent years, Zot deals with her grief by befriending her neighbour, Mrs. Sloane, and teaching her dog how to read. From here on out, a good part of the narration is done by the dog. I wish I was joking. He does a kind of observational comedy at one point. Zot gets booked as the star of her own cooking show. The head of the studio wants to put her in a pretty dress, make cocktails, smile for the camera. But Zot isn't having any of it. It's effective, seeing her resist every female stereotype they throw at her. But here's what lets it down. First, why is this happening 3/4 of the way through the book? Why wasn't this the halfway struggle, or even the opener? I feel like I'm at a restaurant and they just served me bread rolls for starter and main course, then a whole turkey for dessert. Second, and this feeds into my main point, that the book is clumsy as hell, Zot never seems to struggle. She suffers, yes, but that's not the same thing. She doesn't like the way the studio works, so she declares it has to change, and then it goes on to do so. It's a fine line, character struggle. You want to see them succeed, but it needs to be through their own growth that they do so. Zot doesn't grow, she never changes. She starts and ends as intelligent, capable, and uncompromising. Zot stays on the show for 2 years, but finds the stress getting to her. She wants to focus on her research and spending her free time with Chip the Wonder Dog. Through a series of misadventures and shenanigans, her late partner's mother, Avery Parker, shows up, buys her old research institute, and hires her as head of chemistry, firing her old boss who did nothing but objectify her and steal her research. There's cake all around, there's a rainbow, and they all live happily ever. Okay, let's get to the problems. Fingers on buzzers. Here's your first out of 10. What's a first-person narrator good for? Getting inside the head of the protagonist? Correct. Here's your bonus question. What's a third-person narrator good for? Sweeping narratives, artistic license, and multiple viewpoints. Correct. Here's your prize, some more whinging. Lessons in Chemistry goes for a multiple viewpoints, constantly shifting kind of third person. The kind when you can hear everyone's thoughts as the scene plays out. I think Garmus might be onto something here. Why spend the time to write subtle gestures that convey emotion when you can just tell the reader how everyone feels? Next, we can work on condensing the whole novel down to a single post-it note with the plot listed out in bullet points, and then we'll be done with this whole novel writing business for good. But even if we ignore the lack of nuance inherent to this method, there's no escaping that it makes it hard to focus on our protagonist. Who has more of a right to the title of main character, Elizabeth or Calvin? Elizabeth, obviously, since Calvin dies a third of the way through, but you don't know that at first. At the quarter-way mark, the main character could be Elizabeth, Calvin, the dog. Fine as this might be in sprawling epics, it doesn't swing well in a book ostensibly about one woman's struggle. Another issue to watch out for when using this method is your third-person narrator getting too judgy. Often throughout the book, the narrator leans in to call someone a dick, and it's impossible to tell where it's coming from. Was that the opinion of the last person to hold the conch? Or was it one of the main characters? Is that God giving his 2 cents on the matter? Your guess is as good as mine. In summary, it's like Dr. Manhattan famously said, omniscience is nice, but it makes it hard to care about the important people, and you lose the right to call anyone a dick. You know, I think Garmus must have been a big Sherlock fan back in the day. Lessons in Chemistry has that old Stephen Moffat problem, where the characters are either smart or dumb, and never the twain shall mingle. Garmus manages to one-up old Mr. Doctor Who by splitting up the good people and the bad people as well. Our characters are either good or bad. You can spot who is who by using this one simple trick the publishers don't want you to know about. The evil people are fat, ugly, rude, and moments away from sexually assaulting every woman in the room. The good people think that maybe you shouldn't execute bunny rabbits using a blender. There's one scene that sums us all up pretty nicely for me. You remember I said Calvin throws up on Elizabeth in the foyer of an opera house? Well, Calvin walked out because he wasn't feeling too hot. But why did Elizabeth leave the opera early? Well, and I'll quote here, as the story unfolded, she realised she didn't find it funny at all. The lyrics were racist, the actors were white, and it was blatantly obvious that the female lead was going to be blamed for everyone else's misdeeds. She didn't like it because the lyrics were racist and they were culturally appropriating. We learn later she was raised by religious fundamentalists in some small town, probably sometime around the Depression era. But now she doesn't like a show because the lyrics are racist. It's not inconceivable that she developed a modern view of race relations despite her upbringing, but it's never mentioned there was a change. She is smart and good, and not being racist is good. Therefore, she's not racist. This isn't just nitpicking either. It would have been interesting and compelling to have Zot grapple with the beliefs she was raised with, the dominant beliefs at the time versus what she feels to be right. But no, this is practically the only time race is mentioned, and it never comes up again. Incidentally, I saw the trailer for the new show that's coming out, and they've really lent into the 60s race relations theme, which is really non-existent in the book. It all goes towards the feeling that I'm calling Lessons in Chemistry, the Playmobil set. The simplicity of the characters combined with the clumsy narration, and well, the, other stuff, makes it all feel like a challenging character study about gender politics in the 60s, as brought to you by Lego. There's a bunch of stuff I didn't have time to mention. I was planning on rattling through all the historical inaccuracies, but then I gave it up. Does it hurt Lessons in Chemistry overall when Zot mentions the Big Bang Theory, even though it wasn't generally accepted until the 70s? Not really. It doesn't help, but a strong sense of place is not one of the book's strengths. we're here for Elizabeth's art, and if you can overlook the clunky narration and 2D characters, then you might have a good time with this book. And hey, if you ever watched Air Bud and thought, this is good, but I'd like it much more if instead of all the basketball, there was an intelligent, borderline autistic woman getting screwed over by the patriarchy, then this is the book for you and your weirdly specific needs.